Hi guys! Chapter 3 is going to discuss the primary physical and mechanical principles under which humans move. So human performance lies on a spectrum of sorts for each principle. So we'll discuss how these principles are utilized by individuals of various skill levels and how that ends up leading them to proficient and efficient movement patterns. The principles of motion and stability help us to define the mechanical laws, which are related to physics, that dictate interactions of constraints. These principles act on all movements and movers, and we're kind of going to pull this together or linking our biomechanical concepts with our motor behavior concepts. So you'll recall the constraints of Newell's model were individual, which could have been related to body structure or more psychological and functional. We had task constraints, which were related to the rules or equipment or constructs of a particular action goal. And then we also had our environmental constraints, which could have been physical, like the physical properties of the world. That's kind of fitting into our mechanical laws here, as well as sociocultural constraints, which are more along the lines of the constraints that society puts on people who fit a certain description. So each of these constraints are going to permit or limit movement. Remember, constraints are not a negative thing. And if any one of them changes, the movement pattern is likely to change. So this is going to require us to calibrate and recalibrate our movements based on the state of the interacting constraints. So I put this GIF one because it's a dog doing maths, but also if the dog was just walking across the bridge, no stick, right? He would just walk, and at that the task of walking across the bridge, the task would be the bridge, or task constraints would be the bridge railings, and those confine the space that he's walking through, right? He has the type of environment and the type of ground he's walking on. Those might be constraining his movement. You can see he has like plants that he's walking over. That would be more of an environmental constraint. And then the individual, those are just his characteristics as a dog, right? When he has a stick, though, he has to recalibrate how he might do that action, and as a result, his movement pattern changes because the task constraints have changed in moving the stick or maneuvering it around the rail. Okay. If we change the environment such that his movements were not constrained by the bridge rails, and let's say he was in an open pasture, his movement might be different than what we see in the GIF, and he could probably run more freely with the stick. Okay, so whenever one of those individual task or environmental constraints change, usually the result is a movement pattern change. So understanding these principles of motion will help us to determine optimal movement patterns. So humans are very good at choosing, or if we think back to our dynamical patterns or dynamical systems theory, we self-organize into movement patterns that are energetically efficient. So as a child grows, their skeleton becomes larger, their muscles become stronger, which are changes or examples of changes in individual constraints. So when we look at the movement patterns of a toddler, while they might not look efficient to us, that the movement pattern they adopt might be the most efficient for them, given their individual constraints. And so as they get older and they get more experienced with different task constraints and different environmental constraints, they learn to adopt more efficient movement patterns to improve their skill proficiency. So in a way, we can use these principles to track motor development to determine how a movement pattern might be optimized for a given individual based on the acting constraints on their body. We also can use these to focus on the critical aspects of movement. So this is something that you actually did in Activity 1 last week, where you observed the proficiency of different throwers, and then you highlighted the key movement features that you felt contributed to a proficient throw. We'll look more at overhead throwing like closer in, I want to say, maybe within the next month. But for now, it's just using your observation and saying, like, what do I know about a throw and what do I think it should look like, right? And then you compared and contrasted skilled versus unskilled performers, and looking at the differences between those performers, you kind of got a better idea about how different or about how proficient performers are going to exploit these various principles, right? And we didn't look too closely into like the biomechanics stuff, but you are able to see how they work differently, and there are reasons to why they work differently. So the textbook kind of presents 6 subtitles or 6 principles, and we'll go through each of them one by one. So we are in a constant state of producing and resisting forces. We resist gravitational force on a daily basis, right? We have to generate force through our muscles to attain certain positions, like you probably are now sitting at your computer. And this is kind of like the studies of forces, how we react and create forces is the study of kinetics in biomechanics. So a lot of our discussion today is focused on biomechanics or physics. Woo! Okay, so if it's not your favorite, I apologize, but there are 3 physical laws that govern how forces work. You might know these as Newton's laws. And Newton's first law states that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion until acted upon by a force. So if you have like a little toy car sitting on a flat surface, the car will not move until a force is applied to it. Now, if we push the car, and let's say it's on a frictionless surface, that car would keep moving until we applied a force to it to make it stop. Newton's second law states that the acceleration of an object is proportional to the force applied to it and inversely proportional to its mass. So we have the acceleration proportional to the force applied, inversely proportional to mass. If we rearrange this equation, we get the more well-known equation, force equals mass times acceleration. Okay, so like the vertical ground reaction force that a person exerts into the ground is equal to their body mass times the gravitational acceleration constant, right? I think if any of you have taken Kin 300, you should be somewhat familiar with this. Okay. Most movement skills have an optimal relationship between force and the distance over which that force is applied. So let's take the example of kicking a soccer ball. Taking a step or running into the kick, like if you think of more professional soccer players, right? Usually that is likely to produce more force translated into the ball than if a person was just kicking from a stationary position. So I have like a visual representation. This would be if the person was kicking from standing, so they have a backswing. They reach the peak of that backswing, and so if we draw kind of this curve from that peak of their backswing and draw an arc to the point of contact with the ball, that's the distance over which the force would be applied, right? So in this instance, the person, if they're just going from standing, their range of motion is a little bit limited to the peak of the backswing. However, if we added a preparatory step, so running into, right, we have now lengthened the area from which our point of contact is with the ground for our planted foot, and now our swinging leg has a longer trajectory, right, from the peak or from wherever the peak ends up being, more about here if we draw a line with this one, right? But now that becomes longer because this front leg is out further. So the larger step into the kick increases the distance over which the foot has traveled. Thus, we're going to end up having a greater angular acceleration, resulting in a larger force applied, right? Because acceleration is proportional to force. It is important to note that we are interested in optimizing the relationship between force and distance, and the distance over which the force is applied. Right, so we have to keep in mind that the quantity of the force is not so much as important as how we are actually producing the force. So if we're using the kicking example, taking a larger step into the kick is an acceptable strategy for increasing force production. So why not just take larger and larger steps if we want to increase the force of the kick? Well, longer steps are going to end up leading to instability of the body. So in order to improve performance, we kind of have to find this optimal balance between the force that we're trying to apply to different objects in our environment and the kind of preparatory steps that we're taking to actually perform the skill that would end up applying the force. When we get into observations of more specific motor skills after exam 1, you'll kind of get a better idea of how this principle applies to the observed differences in movement characteristics with increasing skill proficiency, because we get to look at videos of people as we go. The next principle of movement is related to Newton's third law of action and reaction. So this law states that for every force you exert on an object, the object exerts an equal force back to you and in the opposite direction. So when we're walking, we have equal and opposite forces that are occurring between the feet and the ground, right? As you push down and back on the ground, say as you're kind of in your propulsive phase of your stance, the ground is going to push up and forward on your foot. Now, typically when we have one force that is greater in a certain direction or in a combination of directions, that's when we see movement of the body or the object. So if you're pushing down and back into the ground, that's going to allow us to propel forward. When forces are applied outside of the desired plane of motion, that's when we have a resulting, we call that an undesired reaction force. So if we're walking, let's say that primary plane of motion is the sagittal plane because we're moving in a forward direction, lots of flexion and extension. Okay, and suddenly a ball comes flying towards your head, right? That's going to introduce a horizontal force outside of your desired plane of motion, which is going to end up causing variability in your movement or detraction from the performance of the task you're trying to perform. So you might duck to avoid the ball, you might stumble in attempts to avoid the ball, you might get hit by the ball and fall down, right? But in all cases, this undesired reaction force being introduced outside of our desired plane of movement is going to cause some shift in our movement pattern. Some other examples of Newton's third law in action are use of oppositional arm and leg movements. So that's a movement pattern we adopt when we're doing locomotor activities to create stability by keeping our center of mass inside a boundary of stability. Right, so when the right leg moves forward, our left arm usually moves forward, vice versa, right? And that allows us to keep our center of mass inside our boundary of stability, which we'll kind of touch on in the next slide. We also have the patty cake cats, which is like one of my favorite old YouTube videos, but I think this is kind of a dumb but also relevant example, because they're applying equal and opposite force to each other to not go anywhere, and it's for our amusement. Okay, anyways. Our next principle is looking at the relationship between rotating limbs and projected objects. So this is our relationship that we're looking at here. Particularly an object's linear velocity is the product of the rotational velocity and the radius of rotation. So flashback to biomechanics, we have a lot of different kinematic equations and derivatives that we look at usually. So we can look at position over time, or how a position changes. That's looking at displacement. Position over time would be velocity. If we're looking at velocity over time, that ends up being acceleration. Now, rotational velocity is the rate of change of angular position over time. So if we increase the radius, and I have a better picture here, right? If we increase the radius, this R segment, the arc length is bigger, right? So the arc length, or this change in angular position, is going to be what our W, or this omega sign, it looks more like a W, but this omega sign is going to represent our angular velocity. So increase the radius, increase the angular velocity. Linear velocity changes are going to result from both of these two things changing. So if the radius increases, greater angular velocity, and then our linear velocity is also referred to as tangential velocity. So it's the tangent at any instant of this circular path that some projected item is traveling through. So we often associate the radius of rotation with a limb, or sometimes we might add an implement like a bat or a club or a racket, right? So generally speaking, like your limbs, if we wanted to try to maximize our object linear velocity, or if we're translating movement of our arm into an object, we know that we can maximize that by keeping our arm straight, right? Or maximizing the radius of rotation. Now, the limb length is fixed, right? So how do we modulate limb length? For one, because you can't just say, I'm going to make my arm grow. You could add an implement or some type of piece of equipment that kind of extends the radius of your arm. But it's not really energetically efficient to keep our arms fully extended all the time, okay? Because if you think about generating torque or rotational forces in the body, the longer the moment arm or the radius, the more torque that needs to be produced to move the end point, right? So we can, however, modulate that limb through space by changing the joint positions of the limb in motion. So a common strategy is like waiting to extend the limb before the point of contact, or to the point of release with the projectile object. And we can also do this, again, by adding an implement if it's not already involved in the motor skill. So a good example of this is like using a tennis serve. Okay, so the tennis, in the serve, the arm bends behind the head, and then it reaches, I hope I'm in the camera, it reaches full extension right at the point of contact with the ball, and then that instantaneous linear velocity, or the instantaneous velocity from this angular arc that we've made with the arm, ends up getting translated into the ball. Thus we have a higher velocity of the service, right? So if we had kept the arm straight all the way through the service, that would eventually take considerably greater amount of force to produce the action, thus less energetically efficient. So we can modulate our limb length by regulating the timing of extension of individual joints to allow us the ability to regulate angular velocity. Right? So by modulating our limb length, we can end up increasing our angular velocity, thus increasing the instantaneous or linear velocity transfer to the object at the point of contact, while still being energetically efficient and improving our performance. So when we consider skill progression, more proficient individuals will have a refined and smooth movement pattern that incorporate these aspects in conjunction with the timing of the movement and the sequence of the skill, which brings us to our next principle of motion, which is the open kinetic chain. So the definition of this is the correctly timed sequence of movements an individual uses to successfully perform a skill. If you break down open kinetic chain, open means like the ability to add elements to the sequence, kinetic referring to movement, chain, linking of those elements. So based on the definition, there's two primary components to the open kinetic chain. That's finding an optimal sequence of events for the particular motor skill, and then fine-tuning the timing of those events relevant to one another to maximize your performance. So one of the most notable changes that we can observe in beginners is the transition from single actions to coordinated sequence, or the ability to link movements together. So when you look back on your activity 1, there was one little girl who just kind of like stood and like pushed the ball like out, right? And then as we saw progression to more proficient skill or proficient performers, right, some people started to take a step. Some people started to incorporate a backswing, right? The most proficient person would have linked all of those parts of the movement sequence together so that it looked like a coordinated movement. So we can use open kinetic chain, and we'll use this pretty heavily once we get into our part 2 when we look at development of locomotor skills and ballistic skills and manipulative skills. Kind of recall Newton's third law of action and reaction. So we're not always solely interested on actually generating forces, but we also absorb forces as well. And there are 2 primary strategies that a person can do to decrease the impact of a reaction force. The first is increasing the amount of time that the impact occurs, and then the second method is to increase the area over which the impact occurs. So I have this GIF of this little boy going down a zip line. Oh. And he's definitely increasing the area over which the impact occurs, but we could also think about things he could have done to not face slam into the pad at the end, right? And that might have been to extend his legs, and then his feet would have made the first point of contact. He could have bent his knees and then let go of the handles, right? So we've got some examples of this that are more motor skill applied, but we have an example of landing from a jump, right? So you notice as she's coming down, she briefly extends her knees, right? And then bends them as she lands, so that's increasing the amount of time that the impact is occurring over. We also have an example of catching a ball, right? So extends the elbow to catch. As soon as the force gets applied to the glove, right, we flex the elbow in to increase the time over which the impact is occurring. Also have an example of falling forward, right? This is a better example of increasing the area over which the impact occurs. So you can see as soon as he falls, he initially catches himself with his hand, which is a very small area to absorb force on. So as a result, he decides to roll onto his forearm, onto his shoulder, which are larger areas to kind of absorb the impact. So that would be an example of increasing the area. The ability to maintain balance and stability are important for becoming proficient in many skills, so we've included those in our list of principles. These 2 terms are often used synonymously, but they are different in their definitions. So stability is an object's or person's ability to resist movement or disruption. Balance is the ability of an object or a person to maintain equilibrium. And the strategies that we often use to increase stability are to increase the size of the base of support. So when you draw a boundary around whatever is in contact with the ground, usually it's your feet, that creates a base of support. So standing on one leg would have a smaller base of support than standing with both feet on the ground. And then sometimes we might use strategies like giving a person a cane or a walker to increase their boundary of stability so that they can be more stable. Another strategy is to lower our center of gravity towards the ground. So this is both an example of a wide base of support as well as a lower center of gravity. But that would, the lower your center of gravity is, the harder it is to tip something over. So that's kind of the idea there. Another strategy is to keep the center of gravity inside the base of support, and this both works with stability and balance. So we have a person standing, this is their center of gravity. This is the projected center of gravity in between their left and right feet, which are creating a boundary of stability. When this little black dot, or their center of gravity, is projected within that boundary, we have a balanced posture. As soon as that projected center of gravity leaves the boundary, that's when we have falls, or we need to change the movement pattern in order to kind of catch our balance. Other strategies that we might use to increase stability are having practice and experience in performing a skill, greater muscular control, which I think we talk about the National platform experiments later. I might be lying, I could be confused with a different class. But also confidence, which is more of an individual constraint, right? And in most cases, when you increase a person's stability, that's going to ensure that they will be more balanced. However, that statement doesn't go the opposite, in saying that being balanced does not always mean a person will be in a stable position, because balance can occur in any state of stability. Okay, more stable means better balance, but sometimes we can also be balanced and mobile. And if the goal is mobility, stability is no longer a desired characteristic of the skill, because it's going to inhibit your movement. So we can be balanced in both stable and mobile situations. But that leads us into our next principle, which is the stability-mobility trade-off. So if stability is an object's or person's ability to resist movement, then mobility is an object or person's ability to move freely. And you cannot fully have one without compromising the other, which is how we get the trade-off. So when we're implementing stability strategies, a person will try to maximize stability, but it's going to be at the expense of moving freely. And if you've taken 312, we refer to this as freezing degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom are all the possible movements that each of your joints can make. So the idea is that if you limit or freeze those degrees of freedom, you only have to control a small number of coordinated parts. So it is usually we see stability strategies implemented in novice performers or people who have like older individuals with like neurodegenerative diseases who have to who already struggle with stability. But those are stability strategies. Mobility strategies are going to be the complete opposite of that. So they will be adopting a movement pattern that allows them to maximize their mobility or the ability to move faster, but they're inherently going to be less stable. Instead of freezing degrees of freedom, we refer to this as freeing degrees of freedom, and allowing our bodies to kind of self-organize into a nice, or a more optimal position is usually going to lead to more proficient movement solutions because the body's not as constrained to the limited joint motion. We have a couple of visual examples of stability strategies, right? So wide base of support, kind of stomping and out-toeing. I don't know, we'll talk about out-toeing in our locomotor lecture, but when you point your toes outward is another way that you can increase your base of support because your boundary is now, has more lateral aspects. Also like Baby Yoda because he waddles. These strategies are being implemented, they limit smoothness and coordination of the movements. As compared to like a dancer or forest running, which are maximizing the mobility of the body. They can still be balanced in these situations, right? But different strategies for different action goals. Okay, to wrap up, once we have a better idea of how these physical principles govern how we move, we can actually use them to observe developmental progression of individuals across the lifespan. Particularly, we would use these principles to help detect and correct errors in unskilled individuals, but we surely can apply this to the entire lifespan. So the first thing we would want to do is observe the completed skill. So make sure you have a good vantage point, you're viewing it from a lot of different angles. Then you want to identify each phase and its key elements, which is what you guys did last week, right? Figure out what the most basic phases of the movement are, what the sequence is, and then from there we would use our knowledge of mechanics in our analysis. So how are they applying or absorbing force? Do they have all the correct steps in the sequence? Are those steps timed correctly? Are there any other movement strategies they can use to improve their efficiency and or proficiency? From there, once you figure out what's missing from their movement pattern, you select the errors to be corrected. Usually we're going to focus on larger errors first before smaller ones. And then after that, we can decide on the appropriate method of correcting the errors. So this is where motor learning principles really come in handy, where you consider what type of feedback you give people, how you time the feedback, what the method of feedback is. If you're giving them verbal instruction, are you doing demonstrations? Are you using technology in the sense that you film and then do like a replay? So that part ends up being kind of up to the motor learning specialist or the coach or whoever's the person who's doing all of these observations. But overarching concept of this chapter is there are physical principles that constrain how we move, right, based on physical laws. And there are certain parts of those principles that are going to lead to more proficient movement behaviors, which we'll start to observe after exam 1. All right, that concludes our lecture material for the week. If you have any questions, please let me know.